Natalie Hart walked into the Sinclair Vineyards summer gala with one goal in mind: to make Derek Voss watch the woman he had humiliated glide past him glowing on the arm of the most devastating man money could rent for an evening, and she had no idea that the man she had hired for $400 an hour was about to introduce himself to a ballroom full of Napa Valley's wealthiest as Dominic Sinclair, heir to the very vineyard hosting the party. The moment the words left his mouth, a woman near the champagne fountain gasped loud enough to turn a dozen heads. Someone's phone was already raised and recording, and Natalie felt the marble floor tilt beneath her heels as every plan she had spent 3 weeks assembling collapsed into a single, catastrophic realization. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you hooked, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, because this one only gets messier from here. Across the room, an elderly man in an impeccable navy suit set down his glass of Sinclair Reserve Cabernet, adjusted his glasses, and stared at his grandson with the particular delight of a man who had waited 11 years for exactly this moment, already reaching for his phone to call the family lawyer with what he assumed was very good news. 3 weeks earlier, Natalie Hart had been standing at the altar of St. Helena's Chapel in a dress she had spent 4 months choosing, watching Derek Voss check his phone instead of looking at her, and had known with a sinking, humiliating certainty 2 full minutes before he finally said it out loud that he was not going to marry her that afternoon. He told her, in front of 140 guests, that he had realized he wasn't ready, that he needed space to figure out who he was, and that he hoped she would understand, all while the officiant stood frozen, holding a book nobody would open that day. Natalie had walked back down the aisle alone, her mother crying harder than she was, and had spent the following 2 weeks doing exactly what everyone told her not to do, replaying every detail, wondering what she had missed, refreshing Derek's social media at 2 in the morning until she saw the photo that broke something loose in her chest entirely. Derek at a rooftop bar in San Francisco with his arm around a woman named Priscilla, captioned with 3 words that made Natalie laugh out loud. In the middle of her empty apartment, finally found happiness. When she found out 2 days later that Derek had been invited to the Sinclair Vineyards Summer Gala, the single most photographed social event on the Napa social calendar that year, and that Priscilla would be on his arm as his very public new girlfriend, something in Natalie shifted from grief into something sharper and considerably more useful. She had never hired an escort in her life and had no real intention of starting a habit, but her best friend Jenna, who worked in event planning and had seen every version of Napa Valley excess imaginable, mentioned almost as a joke that there was a discreet companion service catering to exactly this kind of situation. Women who needed a devastatingly attractive date for one evening and nothing more. No questions asked, no strings attached, and Natalie, 3 glasses of wine into a Tuesday night pity party, had pulled up the website before she could talk herself out of it. "You are not actually going to do this," Jenna said over the phone the next morning. Once Natalie confessed what she'd spent her evening researching, though the lack of real conviction in her voice suggested she was more curious than opposed, and when Natalie admitted she'd already put down a deposit, Jenna laughed so hard she nearly dropped her coffee, telling her that if nothing else, she owed her a full recap the moment the gala ended. The profile Natalie selected showed a man with dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and an expression that managed to look both bored and completely aware of exactly how attractive he was, listed under the name Chris, 6'2", fluent in French and Italian, available for corporate events, galas, and, the listing added with a wink she should have paid more attention to, situations requiring discretion. She booked him for the Sinclair Gala without telling Jenna the full price, transferred the deposit before she could second-guess herself, and spent the next 3 weeks buying a dress specifically engineered to make Derek Voss regret every choice he had ever made in his life, trying on 11 different options before settling on a deep emerald gown that made her decide, standing in front of the dressing room mirror, that revenge might genuinely be the best skincare routine she'd tried all year. What Natalie did not know, because there was absolutely no reasonable way she could have known, was that the man behind the profile named Chris was Dominic Sinclair himself, grandson of Elias Sinclair and heir apparent to Sinclair Vineyards, a 120-year-old wine empire currently valued somewhere north of $800 million, and that Dominic had been quietly moonlighting through his college roommate's discreet companion service for the better part of a year under a fake name. Not for the money, which he genuinely did not need, but because it was the only way he had found to spend an evening with a woman who had no idea who he was and therefore no agenda beyond simply enjoying herself. His roommate Marcus ran the service as a side business catering to Bay Area executives who wanted arm candy without commitment, and Dominic had taken exactly 4 bookings over the past year, always far enough from home that nobody would recognize him, always careful, always anonymous. Until the week Marcus's usual scheduling system glitched and accidentally booked him for an event happening at his own family's vineyard, a detail Dominic did not discover until he was already standing in a rented tuxedo in Natalie's driveway, and by then it felt too late and too absurd to explain. So he told himself he would simply keep his head down, get through the evening, and slip away before anyone noticed. That plan lasted exactly as long as it took Elias Sinclair to spot his own grandson across a crowded ballroom holding hands with a woman he had never met, at which point the old man, who had been waiting years for any sign that Dominic might settle into something resembling a real life instead of burying himself in spreadsheets and vineyard acquisitions, called out his name across the room with the booming delight of a man who believed he was witnessing a miracle. Dominic froze. Natalie, standing beside him in 4-inch heels and a dress that had cost more than her monthly rent, watched an elderly man who looked remarkably like the face on every bottle of Sinclair Cabernet she had ever seen march toward them beaming, and felt every carefully constructed plan for the evening dissolve into something considerably more dangerous than public embarrassment. "Dominic, my boy, you never told me you were seeing someone," Elias said, pulling his grandson into a hug that Dominic returned with a stiff, panicked posture of a man being arrested, before turning to Natalie with a warmth that made her stomach drop even further. "And who is this lovely woman who's finally gotten my grandson to smile at something other than a quarterly earnings report?" Natalie opened her mouth to explain that this was, in fact, a paid arrangement between herself and a man she had known for exactly 40 minutes, and closed it again when she caught the look on Dominic's face, a silent, desperate plea that somehow communicated an entire novel's worth of pleas. "For the love of God, do not correct him right now." She heard herself say her name was Natalie Hart, that they had met a few months ago, and watched Elias's face light up with a joy so genuine it made the lie taste even worse in her mouth. By the time they extracted themselves from his grandfather's company 20 minutes later, 3 separate guests had already photographed them together. One of Napa's more aggressive society bloggers had captioned a picture of them dancing with the words "Sinclair Heir finally off the market," and the post had accumulated 4,000 likes before Natalie and Dominic even made it to the parking valet. "I need you to understand that I did not plan any part of this," Dominic said, holding her car door open with the kind of automatic manners that came from a lifetime of expensive schools. "My grandfather has spent a decade trying to get me married off, and if he thinks I've finally found someone, he is not going to let this go quietly." Natalie, still holding her shoes in one hand because her feet had started aching an hour into the disaster, looked at him for a long moment and asked the only question that mattered. "So, what exactly do you propose we do about the several thousand people who currently believe we're a couple?" The answer, over the following 48 hours, turned out to be considerably more complicated than either of them wanted. Elias Sinclair, delighted beyond reason at the prospect of his grandson finally settling down, announced at the family's Sunday dinner that he intended to move forward the timeline on transferring full control of Sinclair Vineyards to Dominic, a process that had been stalled for 2 years over the board's concerns about Dominic's perceived lack of stability. Concerns Elias now considered entirely resolved given the apparently serious relationship his grandson had been hiding from the family. Dominic, sitting across the table watching his grandfather practically vibrate with joy, understood immediately that correcting the record now would not simply be embarrassing, it would cost him the company his family had built over 4 generations, a company he had spent his entire adult life preparing to run, all because of an escort booking glitch and 40 minutes of panicked improvisation at a party. He called Natalie that same night with a proposition that made her nearly drop her phone into her bathtub. "I need you to keep pretending to date me for 6 weeks, maybe 8, just long enough for the board to finalize the transition, and in exchange I will pay you considerably more than $400 an hour, and I will personally make sure Derek Voss and his very public new girlfriend see exactly how well you're doing without him." Natalie sat in silence for long enough that Dominic asked if she was still on the line, and when she finally answered, her voice carried the particular steel of a woman who had just realized she held significantly more leverage than she had walked into this situation with. "Make it $100,000 and I'll consider it." They settled on $60,000 and a signed agreement drafted by Dominic's lawyer that outlined the terms with the clinical precision of a business contract: 6 to 8 weeks of public appearances, no physical intimacy beyond what was necessary to maintain appearances, full termination of the arrangement the moment the board finalized the transition, and a confidentiality clause so thorough that Natalie half expected it to require blood. What the contract did not account for, because contracts rarely account for the things that actually end up mattering, was the way Dominic remembered, without being told, that Natalie took her coffee with exactly 1 sugar and enough cream to turn it the color of caramel, or the way Natalie found herself genuinely laughing at his dry, understated jokes during their third-stage dinner date instead of performing laughter for the cameras Dominic's publicist had strategically arranged nearby. 3 weeks into the arrangement, sitting on the terrace of his family's estate after a dinner that had technically ended 20 minutes earlier, Natalie caught herself telling him the entire humiliating story of her almost wedding, every detail she had refused to share with anyone outside her immediate family, and Dominic listened without offering a single unsolicited piece of advice, which turned out to be exactly what she needed from someone for the first time in 3 weeks of well-meaning friends telling her everything happened for a reason. Their second staged appearance, a charity wine tasting Dominic's publicist had arranged specifically for photographers, nearly fell apart within the first 10 minutes when Natalie, who knew considerably more about wine than she'd let on during their first dinner, corrected Dominic's own tasting notes in front of a small crowd of sommeliers, informing him with a completely straight face that the tannins he'd just described as restrained were, in fact, aggressive enough to peel paint, a comment that made 3 professional wine critics laugh out loud and made Dominic look at her with something closer to genuine delight than he'd shown at any point since the gala. "Where exactly did you learn to talk about wine like that?" he asked her afterward, and Natalie admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that she'd spent 2 years working the tasting room at a much smaller vineyard before switching careers entirely, a fact that had never once come up in her dating profile because most men found it considerably less interesting than she found it herself. Dominic did not find it uninteresting in the slightest, and spent the better part of the following week finding excuses to ask her opinion on blends the estate was considering for the next release, excuses that had less to do with genuine business need and more to do with the fact that he had started looking forward to her voice on the other end of the phone more than he was willing to admit to himself just yet. "He didn't deserve you," Dominic said quietly once she finished, and Natalie, who had heard some version of that sentence from at least a dozen people since the wedding that wasn't, found herself believing it for the first time when it came from him. "That's an easy thing to say when you're getting paid $60,000 to say nice things about me," she replied, though there was considerably less bite in it than she intended. "I'm not being paid to say that," Dominic said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her look away first. "That part isn't in the contract." Natalie told herself that night, lying awake in the guest room of a house larger than the apartment building she lived in, that she was simply imagining things, that 6 weeks of performing a relationship for cameras and a hopeful grandfather had blurred a line that needed to stay firmly in place, and she repeated that same explanation to herself with decreasing conviction over each of the following 2 weeks, as staged handholding started to feel less like a performance, and unstaged laughter started happening more often than either of them planned for. Derek Voss reappeared exactly when the story needed him to be most inconvenient, cornering Natalie at a charity auction Dominic's grandfather had insisted they attend together, informing her with the particular arrogance of a man who had never once considered that his opinion might not be wanted, that he had heard about her new billionaire boyfriend and wanted her to know that Priscilla hadn't worked out, that he had made a mistake leaving her at the altar, and that he was hoping they could talk about what a future together might look like now that he had, in his words, done some real growing. Natalie stood there in a room full of Napa's wealthiest philanthropists, looked at the man who had humiliated her in front of 140 guests and then dated someone else within 2 weeks, and felt something in her that used to ache at the sight of him settle instead into a calm, clarifying anger. "You left me standing at an altar in front of everyone I love, Derek, and the only thing that's changed since then is that I found out exactly how little that used to cost me emotionally, because it costs me nothing now," she told him, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to listen, and walked away before he could formulate a response, straight into Dominic, who had apparently been close enough to hear the entire exchange, and looked, for the first time since she had met him, genuinely furious on her behalf rather than performing concern for an audience. "I could have him removed from every event we attend for the rest of the season if you wanted," Dominic offered, only half joking, and Natalie, surprised by how much she appreciated the offer even as pure fantasy, found herself laughing for the first time since Derek had approached her. That same night, Elias Sinclair pulled Dominic aside during the drive home, mentioned that the board's final vote on the transition was scheduled for the following Friday, only 4 days away, and that he wanted Natalie there when it happened, partly out of genuine affection for a woman who had clearly made his grandson happier than he'd seen him in years, and partly, Dominic suspected correctly, because Elias intended to announce an engagement timeline to the board as further proof of Dominic's stability. Dominic hung up the phone that night and sat with a problem considerably larger than the one he'd started with, because the arrangement had been designed to end quietly the moment the board finalized the transition, and instead his grandfather was actively engineering a scenario where walking away from Natalie would now look like exactly the kind of instability the board had spent 2 years worrying about. He called Natalie the next morning and, for the first time since the entire arrangement began, told her the truth without softening any part of it, that his grandfather wanted to announce an engagement timeline at Friday's board meeting, that refusing outright would likely tank the transition entirely, and that he understood if she wanted to walk away from the arrangement immediately rather than get pulled deeper into a lie that was rapidly outgrowing its original scope. Natalie sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, thinking not about the $60,000, which had stopped feeling like the point of any of this week's earlier, but about the terrace conversation, and the way Dominic had listened to her without trying to fix anything, and the uncomfortable, undeniable fact that the version of herself who had hired a stranger for revenge 3 weeks earlier felt like someone she barely recognized anymore. "What happens after Friday?" she asked. "If we do this and the board approves the transition, what happens to us?" Dominic was quiet long enough that Natalie thought the call had dropped, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the careful, controlled quality it usually carried in business conversations. "I don't actually know anymore, and that terrifies me more than losing the company would." The Wednesday before the board vote, Elias Sinclair invited Natalie to walk the vineyard's oldest block with him alone. No cameras, no Dominic, just the two of them and several acres of Cabernet vines his own grandfather had planted, and told her a story she suspected he had not shared with many people outside the family, about how he had met his late wife working a harvest season at a competitor's vineyard decades earlier, back before anyone in the valley considered the Sinclair name worth much of anything, and how his own father had initially disapproved of the match because she came from a family with no land and no money to speak of. "Everyone in this valley eventually decides love and money are the same conversation," Elias told her, pulling a cluster of grapes from a low-hanging vine and turning it over in his weathered hands. "And every single time, they're wrong about it. I watched my grandson spend a decade letting that same mistaken belief turn him into someone who trusted spreadsheets more than people, and then I watched him introduce me to you, at that gala, looking more alive than I'd seen him look in years, whatever the actual arrangement between the two of you might have started as." Natalie, caught off guard by how directly he'd implied he already suspected something unconventional about their relationship, asked him carefully how much he actually knew, and Elias simply smiled and told her that a man does not build an $800 million company without learning to recognize the difference between a performance and the real thing, and that whatever had started this, he was considerably more interested in where it ended up than in how it began. They walked into the board meeting Friday afternoon with a plan that had nothing to do with contracts or performances, because somewhere in the 4 days between that phone call and the meeting itself, Natalie and Dominic had stopped pretending to each other, even if neither of them had said the words out loud yet, and had instead spent 3 of those evenings together without a single camera or society blogger anywhere nearby. Just 2 people who had accidentally stumbled into something neither of them had been looking for. The board meeting itself turned into something considerably more dramatic than either of them anticipated, when one of the board members, a longtime rival of Elias's named Harold Whitfield, who had spent years angling for more control over Sinclair Vineyards, produced evidence he had apparently spent weeks gathering, a printout of the original escort service booking confirmation under the name Chris, complete with the service's pricing structure and Dominic's actual booking history, and announced to the entire board that Dominic's supposedly serious relationship had actually begun as a paid arrangement, a discovery that he clearly believed would derail the transition entirely and hand him the leverage he'd been chasing for years. Harold Whitfield had sat on the Sinclair Vineyards board for nearly 15 years, ever since his family's smaller neighboring vineyard had been absorbed into the Sinclair holdings during a deal Elias had personally negotiated, a deal Harold had never fully forgiven despite the generous terms attached to it. And he had spent the better part of a decade waiting for any opportunity to weaken the family's control over a company he privately believed should have remained independent under his own name. When rumors of Dominic's whirlwind romance first surfaced, Harold had hired a private investigator within days, not because he cared in the slightest about Dominic's personal happiness, but because 2 years of quietly building a coalition of board members sympathetic to bringing in outside leadership had finally given him enough support that a single credible scandal might be all it took to tip the vote his way. "I have here," Harold said, sliding copies of the booking confirmation down the length of the boardroom table with the theatrical satisfaction of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment more than once in front of a mirror, documented proof that the relationship this board has been asked to treat as evidence of Mr. Sinclair's newfound stability began, in fact, as a commercial transaction between himself and a paid companion, arranged under a false name specifically to conceal his identity. "I would ask this board to consider very seriously what it means for a man's judgment when his entire public persona for the past 2 months has been built on a lie he was clearly comfortable maintaining in front of his own grandfather." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one younger member, who had only joined the board the previous year, actually reached for the printout to read it more closely, while Elias Sinclair sat perfectly still at the head of the table, his expression unreadable in a way that made Natalie's stomach twist with dread. The room went silent in a way that made Natalie's heart hammer against her ribs, and she watched Elias Sinclair's face shift from confusion to something that looked dangerously close to betrayal as he turned to look at his grandson. Dominic stood up before anyone else could speak, and rather than deny anything or offer some carefully lawyered explanation, told the entire board the complete, unvarnished truth that he had been moonlighting anonymously through a friend's companion service for over a year. Not for money he didn't need, but because it was the only way he'd found to meet someone who wasn't already calculating his net worth before the first conversation ended, that the booking with Natalie had been an accident of scheduling rather than design, and that what started as a mutually beneficial arrangement to manage an embarrassing situation had turned, somewhere along the way, into something he had absolutely no intention of walking away from now that Harold Whitfield had decided to weaponize it. The arrangement was real in the sense that money changed hands, Dominic said, looking directly at his grandfather rather than at the board, but everything that's happened since that first gala has been real, in every way that actually matters, and if this board wants to make my personal life a condition of running a company my family has spent 4 generations building, then perhaps this board and I have a bigger problem than one woman's contract. Elias Sinclair sat in silence for a long moment that stretched uncomfortably across the entire room, and then, to the visible shock of Harold Whitfield, began to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to catch even Elias himself by surprise. "You hired a date because you didn't want anyone chasing your money, and you ended up falling for the first woman who had absolutely no idea how much of it there was to chase," Elias said, shaking his head. "That is, without question, the single most Sinclair thing I have ever heard, because your grandmother used to say I fell for her the same way, back before anyone in this valley knew my family's name was worth anything at all." He turned to Harold Whitfield with an expression that had lost every trace of humor. "You spent weeks digging through my grandson's private life looking for a weapon, Harold, and all you found was a boy who wanted to be loved for something other than his last name, which tells me considerably more about your priorities on this board than it does about his character." The vote on the transition proceeded that same afternoon, and passed with a margin that left no room for Harold Whitfield's objections to matter, though the board did, at Elias's insistence, formally note in the minutes that Dominic's personal relationships would never again be treated as a condition of his leadership. Natalie, sitting in the gallery through the entire confrontation with her heart in her throat, found Dominic afterward in the empty hallway outside the boardroom, still visibly shaken from watching his private life dissected in front of the people who controlled his professional future, and asked the question that had been sitting underneath every other thought she'd had for the past 4 days. "Did you mean what you said in there, about everything since the gala being real?" Dominic closed the distance between them before answering, close enough that Natalie had to tilt her head back to keep looking at him, and told her that he had meant every word, that somewhere between a staged dinner date and a terrace conversation about a wedding that never happened, he had stopped thinking of her as an arrangement and started thinking of her as the first person in years who made him want to be somewhere other than behind a desk. Natalie, who had walked into the Sinclair Vineyards gala 8 weeks earlier wanting nothing more than to make her ex-fiancé jealous, found herself standing in a hallway telling a billionaire winemaker that she had been terrified of exactly this outcome since the terrace conversation, because the last time she let herself believe someone meant every word, she had ended up standing alone at an altar in front of everyone she loved. "I've been left before, Dominic. I won't make that mistake again," she said, and watched him consider the words carefully before answering. "Who said this time you'd be the only one who could lose something?" Dominic said quietly, and something in the steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance that had defined every other moment of their arrangement, finally convinced Natalie that whatever this had become, it had stopped being a contract weeks ago. They did not resolve everything in that hallway, because 6 weeks of complicated history and one deeply chaotic contract do not untangle themselves in a single conversation, but they walked out of the Sinclair estate that evening together, without cameras, without an audience, and without a single carefully rehearsed word between them, for what felt to both of them like the first entirely honest moment of the entire arrangement. 3 months later, Sinclair Vineyards' Harvest Gala drew the largest crowd in the estate's history, partly because of the record vintage Dominic had personally overseen as the vineyard's new CEO, and partly because half of Napa Valley had spent the season following the increasingly public romance between Dominic Sinclair and the women's society blogs had nicknamed the Reluctant Heiress, a title Natalie found ridiculous and secretly loved more than she would ever admit out loud. Derek Voss did not attend that year's gala, having quietly stopped receiving invitations sometime after the story of his altar humiliation resurfaced online alongside photos of Natalie glowing on Dominic's arm, and Natalie found she did not think about him nearly as often as she once assumed she would, mostly because there was considerably less room left in her life for a man who had once made her feel small, now that it was occupied by one who consistently made her feel like the most important person in any room he was standing in. Priscilla, as it turned out, had left Derek within a month of Natalie's confrontation at the charity auction, a detail Natalie learned secondhand through a mutual acquaintance and found she genuinely did not care about one way or another, which struck her more than any single grand romantic gesture Dominic had offered over the past 3 months. As the clearest possible sign of how far she had actually come since the afternoon, she stood alone at the front of an empty aisle. She thought sometimes, late at night with Dominic's arm around her and an entire vineyard's worth of quiet dark hills visible through the bedroom window, about the version of herself who had hired a stranger out of spite and humiliation, and found she could not bring herself to regret a single decision that woman had made, not the booking, not the dress, not even the 3 weeks of quietly nursing a broken engagement, because every one of those choices had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, delivered her exactly here. Elias Sinclair, watching his grandson and Natalie dance together near the same champagne fountain where an elderly woman had gasped loud enough to start the entire chaotic story 3 months earlier, turned to an old friend beside him and remarked that he had spent a decade trying to engineer his grandson into a suitable match through introductions, dinners, and no small amount of not-so-subtle pressure, only to watch it happen instead through an escort service booking error and a woman with absolutely nothing to gain by pretending to love someone she didn't. Harold Whitfield resigned from the board quietly within a month of the vote, once it became clear that his gamble had cost him whatever remaining support he'd spent years building among the more sympathetic board members. several of whom later admitted privately that watching him weaponize a man's private life in pursuit of corporate leverage had told them considerably more about his character than